Alright, so we've been going to space for the past 50 to 60 years, and over that course of time we've been to the moon, we've orbited around Earth, we've orbited around the moon. And most of that development and innovation in the space industry occurred in the 1960s, mid to late, and that is actually when NASA had its highest spike in budget. Back then, NASA had a budget of 4.4% of the total federal budget. However, in 2018, when space isn't a major interest of people of really any nation, NASA has a budget of 0.47% of the total federal. And that shows a significant decrease of, it has about 10% of the budget it did back in the 1960s. And that just shows how little innovation there is coming from NASA and, in general, the world. Back in the 1960s, we were constantly sending space missions, not only to the moon, but just around the Earth, testing docking procedures, and sending people to space, and just all these new and massive milestones. It has been 50 years since we first landed on the moon, and 51 years since we first orbited the moon. Now, what did this spike in budget actually come from back in the 1960s? Well, I would actually claim that the space race is almost like a second front for the Cold War. In 1965, which is the year NASA had its largest piece of the pie in terms of budget, that is when LBJ sent the first large amount of American troops to Vietnam. So here we see a ramping up of not only the Cold War, but also in the space race. Now, modern day space travel is pretty weak right now. We have the space station, which is our most major project. In fact, it's the most expensive building humanity has ever built. We send people there constantly, but we don't send them there on American rockets or new rockets. In fact, the rocket that has been taking people to the space station for the past roughly 10 years is the Soyuz rocket, which is a variation of the R-7 rocket. And the R-7 rocket was the first rocket to launch a man-made satellite into orbit. That just shows the lack of innovation in this sector. And as we continue on our path where people refuse to change not only the way they consume energy, but also the way they produce it, we are sending more toxic and dangerous greenhouse gases into the atmosphere every day, which is causing temperatures to rise, global ice caps to melt, which causes less land to settle on for more people, an increasing rate of people coming up. And then we see just this massive wave of pollution, and our population is growing exponentially, and our temperatures are as well, which causes agricultural rates to go down the way we grow. And that just shows that our Earth is becoming slowly more and more of a worse place to live. So we might actually have our only option to be is space. And right now, innovation in the space industry is coming from privately funded companies like SpaceX. It's not government funding. It's not the people's funding. It's just private funding. It's people who want to make money off the space industry by launching satellites for communications and mostly television. And however, SpaceX is planning their first Mars missions with their BFR rocket, which is actually kind of impressive. It's a standard for how we're going to travel into space for the future. Maybe space agencies aren't going to be the future, or government-led space agencies. Maybe it's going to be privately funded. So we have all this to look at, and we see that when space travel was a main priority, when space travel was actually being innovative, was all the way back in the Cold War, when people were split between communism or capitalism. Hatred was at an all-time high, and fear. And so maybe to get back into space, to become more innovative in the space industry, we actually need to become more hated, or we need to hate each other more. And maybe then that will push us into space and propel us to a better future. Thank you. That's my speech.
You're gum.